In August of 2015, 16-year-old Nacy Perez suddenly woke up in the middle of the night. As she lay there scanning around the dark, tiny room that she was in, it dawned on her that the most likely reason she had just woken up is because she really needed to use the bathroom. And so she climbed out of her bed and she began carefully walking across the room where her other relatives were sleeping on the floor as she moved towards the back of the house. Nacy lived in a town called La Entrada, which is located in one of the poorest and most dangerous countries in the world, Honduras. But despite the harshness of her reality, Nacy was pretty happy. She had recently married the boy she was in love with. His name was Rudy, and the two of them were both very excited about their first child, which was due in a matter of months. So Nacy reached the back of her house, she pushed open the back door, and she stepped out into the hot night air, and then she made the familiar walk across her backyard toward the outhouse. But Nacy would never reach the outhouse. The next morning, Nacy's mother woke up first. Her name was Maria, and as she passed by the back door, she looked outside and she saw Nacy lying on the ground. And so Maria, she screams, she runs outside to her daughter and she flips her over and she's looking at her, and Nacy is unresponsive and she's foaming at the mouth. Now, they're in a part of the world where healthcare was not top-notch, not even close. And Honduras is known for being an extremely religious part of the world. And so Maria did not think, oh, I should send my daughter to the hospital or I should call a doctor. Instead, Maria and the rest of Nacy's family, who had all streamed outside because of the commotion, they decided to call a priest to perform an exorcism because the belief was Nacy must be possessed with demons. And so a priest was hailed to the residence, and the priest would perform an exorcism on Nacy, but it wouldn't do anything. And so at that point, Maria and the rest of Nacy's family would take Nacy, who was still totally unresponsive and foaming, to the local hospital. But by that point, it was too late. Nacy was dead. When Nacy's family asked the doctors what happened to her, they said they didn't know. And so heartbroken and confused, Maria and the rest of Nacy's family brought Nacy back home. They had an ad hoc memorial service, and then they buried her. The following day, Nacy's husband, Rudy, who was totally distraught because he has not only lost his wife, he's also lost his unborn child. He got up early and he just had to go to the cemetery to be with his wife. And so he made his way over to the local cemetery and he found his wife's gravesite. Nacy had not been buried under the earth. Instead, she had been placed into a coffin, and that coffin had been slid into this big hollowed out cement block that was as big as a coffin. And then once the coffin was slid inside, they walled up the opening. So basically her gravesite was this kind of freestanding big cement block. And so Rudy finds Nacy's cement block and he goes up right next to it and he leans up against it and he begins to quietly sob. But just seconds later, he would hear something in that cemetery that would cause him to go completely silent, stand up, and sprint away. The day before, approximately 1 or 2 hours after Nacy's coffin was slid inside of that cement tomb and walled up, Nacy woke up. She was never dead. It's unclear what originally caused Nacy to collapse outside of her house on the way to the outhouse, but the two leading theories are, 1, she had a severe panic attack caused by a nearby gunshot, or 2, she had a severe episode of cataplexy. Cataplexy is the sudden, uncontrollable loss of muscle function, often brought on by very strong emotions. A mild case could be just having your knees buckle for a second. A severe case, which is what they believe could have happened to Nacy, would result in basically complete paralysis. But whatever the case was, the doctors at the hospital got it wrong. When Nacy was brought to them, she was not dead. And so when she woke up inside of her coffin that was encased in cement, she began shrieking and trying to pound up against the inside of these tight walls that were pressed up against her. And at some point, she even managed to force her hands up near her head, and she shattered the glass window that sat in her coffin that looked right down at her face. She broke the glass, but it didn't help her at all because, again, it's just cement on the other side. And so glass shards fell into her mouth and into her eyes. And so she stayed like that, screaming and trying to fight her way out for over 24 hours, trying to get anybody's attention, but nobody heard her. until her husband, Rudy, he leaned up against her tomb and he put his ear right up against the cement and began to cry. And that's when he heard through the cement the sound of his wife calling out for help. Rudy instantly ran and got help, and he and his family came back and they broke open the side of this tomb and they pulled Nacy's coffin out. And even though she was now unresponsive, she had a faint heartbeat. And so they rushed her to the hospital, but by the time she got there, she really had died. Nacy had finally just run out of oxygen, likely within minutes of her husband finally hearing her screams. In the spring of 2021, 52-year-old Texas resident Karen Davis got married, and then after the ceremony and after the honeymoon, she went through the process of changing her last name from Davis to McBride to match her husband's last name. After the change was done, the last step was to get a new driver's license with the new name on it. So Karen emailed the local DMV, or Department of Motor Vehicles, to set up a time for her to come in and make the change to her license. But after she sent that email, the local DMV immediately emailed Karen back, and they told her that they could not help her with this request until she resolved an issue. Now, they didn't specify what this issue was. However, they very cryptically said it had something to do with the state of Oklahoma. And then at the bottom of the email, there was just a phone number they told her she needed to call in order to resolve this issue. And so Karen's thinking, okay, that's pretty weird, but I did used to live in Oklahoma, so that probably has something to do with it. And so, not thinking much of it, she punched this number the DMV had given her into her phone, and then she let it ring. A few moments later, much to Karen's shock, a woman from the Norman, Oklahoma District Attorney's Office picked up the phone and said, "How can I help you?" Karen immediately assumed that the DMV must have made a mistake, that maybe they were trying to give Karen some other number in Oklahoma because this was an Oklahoma problem, and they had mistakenly given her the number to the DA's office. But since she had this woman on the phone, Karen told her, hey, I was just trying to get a new license in Texas. They told me there was some sort of issue. It had to do with me potentially living in Oklahoma. I don't know what it is, but this is the number they gave me. So I'm sure it's a mistake, but that's why I'm calling. The woman from the DA's office had no idea who Karen was, but after taking down Karen's information and looking on her computer, she discovered Karen's so-called Oklahoma problem. And after she explained to Karen what this enormous problem was, Karen literally couldn't believe it. But after this woman went over the details a few more times and really showed Karen that this Oklahoma problem was very, very real, suddenly everything in Karen's life made sense. For the last 22 years, Karen, who was incredibly smart and friendly and polite and never had a problem with anyone, had an incredibly hard time getting a job. Even jobs that she was extremely qualified for, she would get turned down for someone who was way less qualified. And then, in the rare times that Karen did actually get hired, she would always get fired for no reason. And so Karen never understood why she was being treated this way until now. It would turn out 22 years earlier, which is when Karen's hireability issues began, she lived in Norman, Oklahoma, which is where the DA's office was that she would end up calling 22 years later. And when she was living in Norman, she lived with a roommate. And this roommate was this nice young man who had a couple of young kids. And one weekend, he went to the local movie store called Movie Place, and he rented the hit 90s movie, Sabrina the Teenage Witch, to watch with his kids. And after he was done watching this movie, he didn't return the VHS tape of Sabrina the Teenage Witch back to Movie Place. Now, normally when this happened, the movie store would just hit the card holder with lots of late fees, which was actually great for the movie store. They made lots and lots of money on individual people that just forgot to return their movies. And if the card holder just continued to hold on to this delinquent movie, at some point the movie store would just hit them with a final fee that basically accounted for the total cost of the VHS tape that they had effectively stolen. And then at that point, the matter was resolved. The card holder owned the VHS tape, whether they knew it or not, and the movie store simply moved on. But in this case, Movie Place in Norman, Oklahoma didn't think that was enough. And when Sabrina the Teenage Witch was not returned in a timely fashion, they pressed charges against the card holder. And the card holder was Karen Davis. The roommate had just borrowed her card. And somehow, these charges against Karen were never brought up to Karen. She was never contacted by anyone, and so for 22 years, she was technically a wanted felon, meaning every time one of her employers, either during the interview process or after she was hired, when they would run a criminal background check on her, it would pop up she was wanted for felony embezzlement. And so this was the reason she kept not getting jobs and kept getting fired from jobs. Since discovering these charges, Karen worked with the Norman, Oklahoma DA's office and got these charges dismissed. You know what really makes me want to slap the like button with a tasseled wobble gong? Inflation! Prices are going through the roof right now, which is why I'm excited to partner with Current again. So thank you to Current for sponsoring today's video. Also, stick around to the end of this sponsored segment because I'm going to be sharing the best like button gags you all sent me a couple of weeks ago on Current during our last cash giveaway. Current is the mobile banking app that, unlike boring old banks, they actually help you take control of your money, which is more crucial than ever right now. Old banks, just like the like button, they just charge you fees and slow you down. But with Current, there are no monthly fees, and the app is super easy to use. And while other banks earn you basically nothing on your savings, with Current, you can earn over 40 times the national average. Because of the strain inflation is having on all of us, Current and I are giving away $2,500 to you all. For a chance to win part of the $2,500 giveaway, all you have to do is click the link down below, download Current, and then use my code BALLEN250. And now here are the top 5 like button gags we received. My favorite was from Regina. Please invite the like button to the zoo with you, and then cover them in honey, and then accidentally push them into the bear enclosure. Okay, back to the stories. In the early evening hours of December 24th, 2011, so Christmas Eve, 26-year-old Zazel Preston sat on her bed in her little apartment in Anaheim, California, and wrapped Christmas gifts for her children. Laying next to her was her newest addition to the family, her third child, a 7-week-old little boy. This Christmas was a big deal for Zazel. It was also a big deal for her husband, 30-year-old William Wallace, not only because it was going to be the first Christmas with their new son, but also because this was the first Christmas after Zazel and William had reconciled their relationship. They had been married for the past 3 years, but over those 3 years, their relationship had been very unhealthy and toxic and at times abusive. But earlier that year, when Zazel had discovered that she was pregnant, this baby became kind of like a new anchor point for their relationship. It was like suddenly they could put their differences aside and just focus on raising their kids together. After wrapping her final present, Zazel hopped off the bed, she scooped up her little boy, and then she headed out into the living room where she met up with her husband and her 2 older children, who were little girls aged 3 and 8, and then they all headed outside and went next door to celebrate Christmas Eve at a party with their neighbors. Early the next morning, so on Christmas Day, Zazel's 2 oldest children, the 2 girls, they got up early and they rushed out of their bedrooms and they ran down the hallway into the living room where their parents were waiting for them on the couch along with their baby brother. The living room was completely decked out with Christmas decorations that the family had put up over the past couple of weeks. The Christmas tree was in the corner with bright multicolored lights and ornaments all over it. There were wreaths on the wall and other string lights around the top of the room. And then over their fireplace were all of their stockings nailed up, stuffed with goodies. The little girls squealed with delight and ran around the couch and took up spots right underneath the Christmas tree, and they grabbed their first present and they turned and looked at their parents on the couch and they saw their dad kind of give them a nod of approval, which meant, okay, you can start opening your gifts. And so the girls happily began tearing into the festive wrapping, and then after each of them had their brand new toy in hand, they turned around reflexively to show their parents. And so William, he sees the toys and he says, oh, they're so great, guys. And then when the girls, they look at their mother and they show her the toys, she doesn't even react. She completely ignores them. And so at some point, these little kids, they start yelling for their mom, hey mom, check it out, look at this new toy. But Zazel just sits there. She doesn't say a word. She's just sitting back on the couch, completely ignoring them. Finally, the 8-year-old turns to William and says, what's wrong with mommy? And at this point, William pauses and then he gives Zazel a scathing look before very bluntly saying to these young kids, mommy got drunk and now she's ruined Christmas. The girls knew from William's tone of voice that their parents must be fighting, and so they did what they normally did when this happened, and that was to just try to ignore it. And so the little girls, they turned away from their parents and began opening more presents, doing their best not to disturb their parents, who were sitting silently behind them. And then, a little after 9 a.m., after most of the presents had been opened, William abruptly stood up and walked into the other room and placed a phone call. And then, a few minutes later, there was a loud knock on the front door. The night before, after Zazelle and William and their kids had left their neighbor's party and come back to their apartment, Zazelle and William had gotten into a vicious fight. And by the time the kids had all gone to bed, the fight between the parents had become very physical. Neighbors would recall late at night on Christmas Eve hearing this very loud commotion coming from Zazelle and William's apartment. And at some point, apparently Zazelle had tried to run out of the apartment, but William had chased after her and hauled her back inside. The sounds coming from their apartment would eventually stop somewhere in the wee hours of Christmas Day. And then as the sun came up on Christmas Day, Zazelle and William had made their way to the couch, and they were sitting there with their 7-week-old baby, waiting for their two oldest to wake up and come open presents. Except when their two little girls came out of their bedrooms and bombed into the living room to begin celebrating, only William was alive. Zazelle had been beaten to death by William. And after he had beaten her to death the night before, he had dragged her into the living room, set her up on the couch to make it look like she was sitting, and then put sunglasses on her eyes in order to trick the children. And so all morning, as this 3-year-old and 8-year-old are opening these gifts and turning and showing their mother with excitement, she was dead the whole time. But at around 9 a.m., William realized his charade was not going to last because his kids were really keyed in to there being something wrong with their mother. And so that was when he got up and he called 911 and he told them that his wife had gotten drunk and fallen into a glass coffee table, and so she was hurt. And so a little bit later, the police and paramedics, they arrive, they go inside, and right away they can tell William is lying to them. There's more to this story than they're being told. And so ultimately, William would be convicted of second-degree murder, and he would be sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. As for Zazelle's 3 children, they are now being looked after by her parents. On February 15th, 2004, 2 police officers drove down a quiet street in a little English village called Murrow, and they pulled over in front of this little brick bungalow. Earlier that day, a neighbor who lived on this street had called the police to report hearing a strange digging sound coming from inside of this bungalow. And so these officers had been sent out to see what the sound was and make sure the occupants of this home were okay. Now, these 2 officers were not particularly worried about the occupants of this house. They assumed that some wild animal must have snuck in while the owners were away, and that was all this was. But, as they would quickly learn, that was not the case. After climbing out of their car, the 2 officers just stopped and listened for a second to see if they could hear this digging sound, but the bungalow was quiet, the street was quiet, and so the 2 officers shut their car doors and made their way up to the front porch of this bungalow and knocked on the front door. After a few moments, when nobody answered, one of the officers reached down and tried the handle and found it was unlocked. And so he opened the door just a crack and he called out through this opening in the door into the bungalow saying, "Hey, it's police, we're here to check on you." But when no one called back to them, the officer opened the door the rest of the way, and immediately both officers saw there was a huge problem inside of this house. The entire first floor was flooded with several inches of water, and they could hear from somewhere in the back of the property the sound of running water. And so again, both officers called out into this house to try to get the attention of anyone who might be inside, and when again they were met with silence, the officers walked into the flooded house and began walking straight back towards this running water sound. And eventually, after walking through the living room, they entered this hallway that went right to the back of the property, and as soon as they were in it, they could see there was an open door at the end of the hallway on the left, and it seemed like the running water sound was coming out of that room. And so the 2 officers, one by one, sloshed down this hallway to this room. They turned left, looked inside, and what they saw completely shocked them and immediately sprung them into action. 2 months before these officers came to this bungalow and found it flooded with water, The owner of this bungalow, 51-year-old Ronald McClagish, had broken up with his girlfriend, and this breakup was really hard on Ronald. He was already divorced, he was totally broke, he had loads of health issues like bad asthma, he had some liver issues, and just generally he was someone who was kind of physically frail. And so this girlfriend had been one of the very few good things in his life, and now she was gone and he was alone again. And so very quickly after this breakup, Ronald fell into a very dark depression. And so for 6 weeks after they broke up, Ronald, for the most part, just stayed in bed and kind of moped around his bungalow, kind of feeling bad for himself. But then finally, at the end of those first 6 weeks after the breakup, Ronald decided he wanted to get his life back together and just move on. So on February 1st, 2004, so roughly 2 weeks before those two officers would come to his bungalow because of this digging sound, Ronald would wake up feeling determined to start anew. And the first thing he was going to do was purge his bungalow of anything that was his ex-girlfriend's. She left a lot of things behind when they broke up. She had not collected them. And so now they were just kind of sources of pain. And where most of her stuff was inside of Ronald's bungalow was in this closet in one of the bedrooms at the end of the hall. So that morning, Ronald headed down the hall. He turned left into the bedroom. He opened up the closet. He went inside, and with a trash bag in hand, he began rifling through everything in this closet, and anything that was hers, he would take it and put it right into the trash bag. And at some point, when Ronald was almost done pulling the last few things of his girlfriend's out and into the trash bag, from behind him, he heard this strange sound coming from the bedroom. It sounded like wood bending or creaking, but before he could turn around to see what the sound was, the door to the closet he was in slammed shut with incredible force, and suddenly Ronald was trapped inside of this closet in total darkness. Now, Ronald was likely shocked at first, but he would have reached and tried for the handle and found that no matter what he did, he could not open this closet again. And so Ronald began screaming for help and pounding on the door, but nobody came to help him. The closet that Ronald was in was fairly tall, but it was only 2 feet wide by about 2 feet deep, which meant Ronald could only stand inside of this closet. He couldn't sit down, he couldn't bend down, he literally was trapped standing. And Ronald didn't have water, he didn't have food, he knew that no one was going to be checking on him anytime soon, and even though his bungalow was kind of small and shabby, it was built out of brick. And so the likelihood that his calls for help were penetrating outside loud enough that people could hear them and that they would come in and rescue him was pretty slim. And so at some point that evening, Ronald realized he needed to do something different if he was going to get out of this closet. And so above him were a series of pipes across the ceiling. And so he reached up and he grabbed one of them and he broke it off. He was likely thinking that with this pipe, maybe he can burrow a hole in the wall and crawl through to another room, or maybe he can punch a hole in the door and somehow unlock it, or at a minimum, with the metal pipe, smashing it against the wall or the door would be louder than any noise he could make by yelling. However, the second he broke that pipe off the ceiling, something horrible happened. The pipe he broke was a water pipe, and as soon as it was broken, icy cold water began pouring down directly on top of Ronald's head and face. And again, because he can only stand basically in the middle of this closet, he couldn't get out of the way of this water. It was like he was under a waterfall and couldn't go anywhere. And so he likely tried to ignore the water and tried to use the pipe and screamed and do anything he could to get someone to know he was in here, but no one could hear him. And so it was like he was being tortured with this freezing water, and he's in this tight claustrophobic space. It's total darkness and he's totally panicking. And for days and days, that would be Ronald's nightmarish reality. But despite how terrible his circumstances were, Ronald continued to use that pipe to both smash the walls to make loud sounds. He also began burrowing into the walls, trying to make a hole. But Ronald was getting weaker and weaker. He became very sick. And also, because the water was constantly hitting his head and face, his skin got so saturated that literally his skin started falling off. It basically opened up into these sores and began to sag, and the water just began brushing his skin off. And so finally, after about a week of being trapped in this closet in these terrible conditions, Ronald realized help was not going to come in time, and so he put his pipe down, he kind of slumped up against the wall, and then closed his eyes. Ronald's neighbor, who called the police, actually did hear Ronald using that pipe to try to dig a hole in his wall, and she heard Ronald smashing the pipe on his door, and she must have heard muffled shrieks and yells. But she didn't know what they were and kind of just decided it wasn't her business. But when Ronald's house went from all these strange sounds to silence, that was when she called the police and said, "Hey, I had heard some digging sounds coming from the bungalow, and now I don't." And so when those two police officers arrived at Ronald's bungalow, they went inside, they went down the hallway, they went into the bedroom where Ronald had gone, and they saw this huge wardrobe, which is a big wooden piece of furniture, toppled over right in front of the closet. And at the bottom of the closet, they saw two human feet protruding from underneath that little space at the bottom of the closet. Those feet belonged to Ronald. He had managed to force his feet underneath the closet, but of course, he could not have fit underneath the closet door. And so the two police officers rushed over, and together, they barely were able to get this wardrobe off of the closet door. And when they opened the door up, Ronald was in there, he was deceased, his body was still in a standing position, kind of rigid and propped up against the wall, and freezing water was still pouring down onto his head. It would turn out no one had intentionally trapped Ronald. Instead, his wardrobe was just unstable, and it happened to topple over at the worst possible moment. On Thanksgiving morning in 1900, an 18-year-old named Thomas Pedler told his mother that he was going out for a bit, but he'd be back in time for turkey that afternoon, and then he grabbed his jacket and his coat and he headed out the door. Thomas lived in a very working-class neighborhood in San Francisco, California, where, generally speaking, nothing big really ever happened. It was kind of a place where people just worked, and that was it. But on this day, something huge was happening in Thomas's neighborhood. The big football game between Stanford University and the University of California was taking place at the stadium in Thomas's district, and they were expecting over 20,000 people to cram into this stadium. And so Thomas was not about to miss this incredible spectacle, even though he didn't have enough money to buy a ticket. But he knew he would find a way to watch this game. And so Thomas leaves his house and he runs to the stadium, which was not far from his house, and he waited in front of the front gate where all these people are streaming in to go into the stadium. And around 11 a.m., Thomas's very close friend, Charles, who was also a young man, made his way to the front gate. The two met up, and at first, their plan was to try to sneak in with the horde of people that were making their way into the stadium. But even though they were still hours away from the opening kickoff of this big game, it was at 2:30 p.m., the stadium was packed. I mean, there was nowhere to sit, there was nowhere to stand. People that had tickets who were going in are looking around thinking, where are we going to watch this game? And so Thomas and Charles are kind of like, well, what's the point of sneaking in if there's nowhere to watch? And so they decided, okay, we need to find another way to watch this game. And so they began looking around, and they noticed there was a huge fence that lined the perimeter of this stadium. And they saw there was some people kind of climbed up on this fence trying to get a view down onto the field. And pretty quickly, when Thomas and Charles decided they would try to do that too, they saw that all the good spots on this fence were already taken. The spots that were open provided no view onto the field. And so that option as well didn't work. And so Thomas and Charles are frustrated. They're starting to worry that they will not see this big game. But when they walked back over to the front gates of the stadium, they happened to notice across the street was this group of people rushing over to this big white brick factory building. And they were literally placing ladders up against the sides of this building and beginning to climb up it. I mean, this is a 5-story building, and they are just basically free climbing the windows and the fire escapes. And Thomas and Charles realized that the top of this factory was flat and provided a perfect view down onto the field. And so all these people they're trying to get a good seat to watch this game. And so without any hesitation, Thomas and Charles decide they're going to do that too. So they left the stadium, they ran across the street, and they began climbing up the ladders and climbing the windows and the fire escapes until finally they made it onto the roof, 55 feet off the ground. And when they got up there, there wasn't that many people. And so Thomas and Charles were able to run right over to the front edge of this building and claim a spot with an absolutely perfect view of the game. A couple of hours later, at 2:30 p.m., when the game actually started, the rooftop that Thomas and Charles were on was now completely packed with people. Hundreds of people have climbed up onto this factory. There were some factory workers down below telling people, do not do this, do not climb on top of this factory, it's not safe. But nobody listened to them, and the police either didn't notice this was happening or they didn't care. And so there's all these people that are on this roof, they're all super excited, and the game has begun. It's 2:30, and as soon as the game started, it was like the crowd in the stadium, which could be heard very easily from this rooftop, just kind of erupted, and there were all these bands playing in the stadium. I mean, it was chaos down below, and it really caught on the roof. All these guys, including Thomas and Charles, they're getting amped about this game, they're singing, they're chanting, they're screaming, they're yelling. I mean, it's total chaos. And Thomas and Charles loved it. But about 20 minutes into the game, as Thomas and Charles are enjoying themselves and the crowd is still going wild, a dull cracking sound could be heard coming from one side of this roof. And so Thomas and Charles, they kind of spun around to see where this cracking sound had come from. And when they began looking out across the sea of people, they noticed on the far side of the roof where the sound had kind of come from, they could see people scrambling to get off the roof. But before Thomas and Charles and the other people around them who were watching this happening could figure out what was going on, there was a much louder cracking sound, and suddenly the floor underneath Thomas, Charles, and everybody else collapsed. And immediately, people on this roof fell all the way to the bottom of this factory, 55 feet below. There weren't loads of floors inside of this factory. Instead, it was basically just one big building, 55 feet high, that housed this brick structure right in the center of the factory that was almost as tall as the entire factory. It was almost like the factory was a shell around this brick, smaller structure right in the middle that was like 40 feet tall. And so after the ceiling collapses, Thomas, he falls, but miraculously, he lands on a wooden beam that stretched across the entire factory, like a support beam, and he grabbed onto it, saving himself from falling all the way down. And so Thomas, he only fell maybe 5 feet, so he was okay, but he didn't have a great grip on this beam. He was holding on, but just barely. And so Thomas, he turns and he's looking around at what's happened below him, and he's hearing people screaming, and he's hearing the sounds of people running around trying to help those who have hit the ground on the bottom. And Thomas immediately begins scanning for Charles, and he finds him. Charles was one of the other fairly lucky people, at least in Thomas's mind, Charles seemed lucky, because instead of falling from the roof all the way to the ground, Charles and 15 or 20 other people had fallen right onto that brick structure that kind of made up the main part of this factory. And so Charles had only fallen maybe 10 or 15 feet onto this structure. And so Thomas is thinking, oh, Charles and these other people, they've survived this fall, they're okay. However, the second Charles and the others, who supposedly were saved by landing on this brick structure, the second they hit that brick structure, despite not suffering catastrophic injuries like broken bones and horrible internal injuries, these people on the brick structure began letting out these primal screams, these just horrible, blood-curdling screams. And as they did, these loud popping sounds began coming out of their body, and then their bodies began contorting forward, almost like a bug rolling up onto itself. It would turn out this factory was not a normal factory. This was a glass factory, and in order to make glass, you need to heat sand and some other chemicals up to extraordinarily high temperatures. You need a furnace that can literally burn hotter than lava. And so that brick structure that was housed in the middle of this 5-story tall factory was a glass furnace, and it was on. And so even though the inside of this furnace was the hottest place, it was over 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, the outside of this furnace, where Charles and the others had landed, believing they were saved from this 55-foot fall to their death, was still extremely hot. So hot that the factory workers couldn't even go near the furnace, even with special equipment on. The way they worked with this furnace was with these long metal pokers. They would work the flames and the glass at a distance. And so the instant that Charles and the others landed on the top of this furnace, they began to light on fire. Those snapping sounds that were coming out of their bodies was the sound of them instantly igniting on fire. And so Thomas and the others who had initially survived this horrible collapse watched as Charles and the others shrieked and shrieked, and their bodies continued to contort, and they continued to burn and smolder. And Charles actually, he would roll up so tightly that his body began to roll down the curved side of this furnace, and at some point his body slipped into a crack in the furnace, and he actually fell into the flames inside, at which point he went silent. Around the time that Charles and the others stopped shrieking, a number of people just out on the road heard the commotion, and they came inside, and one of them was Thomas's father. And in a terrible twist of fate, he actually looked up and saw his son clinging to the beam, Thomas, except it was so hot inside of this factory that Thomas was sweating, he was losing his grip, it was really hard to hold on to this beam, and his father watched as Thomas lost his grip and fell the 10 more feet down onto the furnace exterior. He landed feet first, then he fell onto his stomach and his face. He immediately ignited on fire, began shrieking, and then went silent. All told, 23 people would be killed during this roof collapse, and dozens more would be horribly injured and disfigured. This collapse goes down as one of the very worst disasters in sports history. However, on this day, the crowd inside the stadium was so caught up in the game that they actually didn't notice this horrible tragedy taking place just 100 feet away from where they were. It wasn't until the end of the game, when the winning team's fans carried their players in this kind of spontaneous parade out of the stadium to celebrate, that they walked out onto the street and saw all these burnt up, rolled up corpses of the people who had landed on the furnace. In April of 1979, a 69-year-old woman named Monica Myers was appointed mayor of a little village called Betterton in the U.S. state of Maryland. Betterton used to be this very fancy resort town on the water where people from Baltimore and Philadelphia would come there for vacations. They had fancy hotels and restaurants and shops. But by the time Monica became Betterton's mayor, Betterton had kind of gone downhill. People had stopped coming to Betterton, all the hotels shut down or were abandoned or burned down. The summer homes of the rich people from the big cities, those got sold off. And down at the beach, all these glamorous boardwalks literally just kind of crumbled into the sea, and in their place were all these shanty towns where homeless people set up their camps. But Monica had grown up in Betterton, and so she really loved the town and wanted to improve it. And so when she became mayor in 1979, she really leaned into her new role way more than other mayors would. Instead of managing the village from an office, like most mayors would do, Monica literally went out in town and just began doing lots of jobs around the town for free. She would ride around with the police and literally stop crimes in action. One time, she stumbled across someone looting a vacant hotel, and she personally got out, chased this person down, and made them put everything back that they had taken. She would pick up trash on the beach, she would do random repairs on people's homes and businesses all over town, and sometimes she would just go door to door asking people how they were doing. And so very quickly, the people of Betterton really grew to love Monica, and they loved seeing her every single day just out and about making Betterton a better place. And so on March 20th, 1980, roughly 1 year into Monica's tenure as mayor, it was immediately noticeable to the people of Betterton when Monica was nowhere to be seen. That day, she did not go to the police station in the morning like she normally did. She was not seen at the beach doing her trash pickup, and she didn't knock on anybody's door. And so by mid-morning that day, the people of Betterton, all 120 of them, were basically out in force looking for Monica. And at 11:30 a.m., the police in Betterton got a call about Monica. It was this guy who was totally panicked. He could barely make a sentence, and he basically just told the police, "You gotta get here now." And so the police hopped in their cars and they sped to the address this guy gave them. And when they got there, they saw it was this very plain, boxy building that was kind of tucked back in the woods. It was far away from the town center, and really nobody ever went over here. And the police, when they parked their cars, they saw the guy who had called the police, the distraught caller, was standing outside of the front door. He was obviously crying, and he was waving for them to come over and follow him into this building. And so the police got out of their cars, they ran over to this guy, and they're asking him, what happened? Where's Monica? What's going on? But this guy was so hysterical, he really could not describe what happened to Monica. He just kept telling them to come on, follow me. And so he led them into this building, and pretty quickly they entered this huge warehouse where all across the ceiling were these big metal catwalk areas that kind of zigged and zagged all over this warehouse, and below them, all over the floor, were these huge industrial-sized 15-foot tall vats that contained something. And so this guy who had led police here, he stops and he just points at the nearest vat. And so the police, picking up his cue, begin walking towards this vat. And as they got closer and closer, they were hit with this horrible smell that made them gag and cough. And before long, they had to stop and kind of compose themselves. The smell was so bad. It would turn out this building that was kind of removed from the town center of Betterton was Betterton's sewage treatment plant. And that morning, Monica had gone to the treatment plant to help clean some of these 15-foot tall industrial-sized vats that contained human waste. She had done this enough times that when she was here, she did not need any supervision. And so that morning, she was alone. She climbed up onto one of the catwalks over one of these big vats, and she had reached down with her testing kit to test the sewage to see how much cleaning it would need. And as she did that, she somehow slipped and fell into the big vat of human waste. Now, she would not have immediately gone under. It was not like a liquid. It was more like clay or really thick mud, where at first she would have kind of been laying on top of the sewage. But as soon as she tried to move to get out of the sewage would have functioned more like quicksand, where as soon as a part of her body went under the surface, it would not come up again. And so after the police composed themselves, they climbed up onto the catwalk and they looked down and they saw Monica, who was face down, partially submerged inside of this vat, and she was deceased. Her autopsy would reveal that she died of drowning, which means she literally inhaled human waste. $250,000. That's how much you all contributed to Dave Hartsock's GoFundMe page after we covered his story last week on our YouTube channel. Dave is the heroic skydiver who sacrificed his body to save his student. Now, because of that, Dave is totally paralyzed and fully dependent on his mother to take care of him. I spoke to Dave after all this money came in, and to say he's happy is such an understatement. I mean, this literally changed his life, and it's because of you. But as awesome as that is, our work is not done. There are other very deserving people that really could use our help. And one group in particular that really needs attention are the victims of violent crime as well as their families. And that is where the MrBallen Foundation comes into play. Within days of the Uvalde Elementary School shooting, the MrBallen Foundation sent $150,000 to support victims and their families. And going forward, we will continue to support them as long as they need support. This year, in addition to all the donations we expect to receive, our company, Ballen Studios, which is a separate entity, is going to be giving $1 million to the MrBallen Foundation, and all of it will go to the cause. We are not taking any money for profit in MrBallen Foundation. Truly, 100% of donations that go into that foundation go to the cause. And if you don't know this, that is very rare for most charities. Usually, you got to pull money to pay for the the organization? Not for us. It is 100%. You give money to the MrBallen Foundation, it goes right out the door to victims of violent crime and their families. So if you want to join forces with me and the MrBallen Foundation and genuinely make a difference in the lives of people that so desperately need our help, go to MrBallen.Foundation and click on Get Involved at the top of the page. Once there, consider becoming a monthly donor to the Honor Them Society. These supporters not only contribute to the cause, but also they get free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Again, go to MrBallen.Foundation and click on Get Involved to see how you can partner up with me and the MrBallen Foundation. 2013, 46-year-old Paul Baxter started feeling sick. And then he developed a wicked cough that got so bad over a couple of days that he could barely speak because he was just coughing the entire time. And so he went to his doctor, who quickly diagnosed him with pneumonia and put him on a treatment plan. But after several months of being on this plan and not having his condition improve at all, his doctor referred him to a respiratory clinic. There, they did an x-ray of his chest and they discovered a suspicious shadow in the lower right section of his lung. Doctors were concerned, especially given the fact that Paul was a long-term smoker, but before they just put him under the knife and started cutting this out of his lung, they decided they would take a probe with a camera on the end of it and run it down into his lungs and actually have a look around inside. During the procedure, which Paul was awake for, the doctor put the probe down into that shadow area in his lung, and right away he saw this lump. But when he zoomed in with his camera on the lump itself, he saw there was something orange sticking out of it. And so he told Paul there were little pincers at the end of this probe, and he was going to try to move the tissue around to try to see what this thing was, and if it was a foreign object, he would try to pull it out. But when he tried to move around the tissue to get a better look, he couldn't get it dislodged, and so he pulled the probe out, and he told Paul he would need to come back in a couple of days when he could use a longer and more powerful probe. And so Paul looks at the doctor and he's like, well, what is it? What is this orange thing inside of my lungs? And the doctor said, honestly, I have no idea, but it's not supposed to be in there. A few days later, Paul went back in for this follow-up procedure, and the doctor, using this longer, more powerful probe, was able to go down and actually dislodge this orange thing from inside of his lungs. And as soon as he pulled it free, there was a camera screen that was watching in real time what this probe was seeing. And so Paul and the doctor and the other doctors that were in there as well all got to see for the first time what this thing was. And it was this kind of triangular, small orange thing that nobody had seen before. And so as it was getting pulled up and out of Paul's body, everyone's just watching the camera, wondering what this thing is. And then finally, the pinchers came out of Paul's mouth, revealing what it was holding on to, and nobody could believe what they were looking at. What it was holding on to was a small plastic orange traffic cone from a child's play toy set. And as soon as Paul saw it, a memory came rushing back to him, and he told the doctors when he was 7 years old, he swallowed, or so he thought, a cone that looked an awful lot like this one, except he hadn't swallowed it, he had inhaled it. And then somehow, for 40 plus years, he'd had no symptoms related to it until now when he developed that cough. Paul would say when he had this revelation in front of the doctors, there was a moment of silence, and then everybody just started cracking up laughing because none of the doctors had seen anything like it before and didn't really know how to react to it. And so Paul was allowed to keep his traffic cone, and after he left, his cough went away and he went back to normal. From the time Gareth Williams was a young boy, his parents knew he was extremely gifted. When he was just 17 years old, he achieved a first-class honors mathematics degree from a university in his hometown of Wales. A couple of years after that, he had his PhD from the University of Manchester in England. And after that, he was accepted into a postgraduate course at one of the most prestigious universities in the world, Cambridge. But he wouldn't finish that degree because his incredible academic achievements had got the attention of Britain's intelligence agencies, and they began recruiting him. In 2001, when Gareth was 23, Britain's communication headquarters, commonly known as GCHQ, which is one of Britain's main intelligence agencies, offered him a job as a codebreaker. He eagerly accepted the job, dropped out of Cambridge, and then moved into a modest apartment in Cheltenham, which is the resort town about 88 miles away from London, where GCHQ is located. And there he would live and work for the next 10 years. Despite being an intensely private and shy person, Gareth was a highly valued team player whose genius in mathematics and technology helped his group win a number of Britain's highest awards for international code breaking. In 2009, one of Britain's other main intelligence agencies, the famous Secret Intelligence Service, or MI6 for short, they were so impressed with Garrett that they offered him a job to come over and work for them. This was a very rare chance for Gareth to go operational and become a spy in the kind of Hollywood sense of the word. He would effectively become a real-life James Bond, and so he jumped at the chance. But shortly after taking the job and moving to London, he regretted his decision. He hated the intense competitiveness within MI6, the flashy cars and flashy lifestyles, and the pressure to go out and party with your coworkers every weekend. Gareth just wanted to do his job and then be left alone. At GCHQ, nobody cared he felt that way. But at MI6, this behavior made him an outsider. Before he left MI6, he took his annual 2-week vacation. But when the vacation was over, he didn't come back to work at his office in London. And for some reason, MI6 never checked in on him to see where he was. It wasn't until his sister called police after not hearing from him that anybody looked into his disappearance. On August 23rd, a uniformed officer went to Gareth's apartment in London to do a welfare check. After knocking on the door and not getting an answer from Gareth, the officer got the key to the apartment from the landlord and went inside. He yelled out for Gareth. There was no sign of him on the first floor. He went upstairs to see if maybe Gareth was up there. He's yelling for him the whole way as he's going up. He gets to the second floor. There's nobody up there, but there's a closed door. And what he finds on the other side of that closed door would make international headlines for weeks. When he opened the door, he walked into a bathroom, and there was nothing unusual about the bathroom, except in the bathtub, there was this big red duffel bag. And inside of that duffel bag was the badly decomposed body of Gareth Williams. The zipper of the bag was padlocked shut on the outside, and the key to this padlock was underneath Gareth's body inside of the bag. There were no fingerprints on the rim or inside the bathtub. There were also no fingerprints on the bag itself, or on the 2 zippers, or on the padlock, or on the keys. Gareth's iPhone had been found nearby sitting on a table, and it had been factory reset. And later, investigators would determine it had been reset on August 15th, which was the last day Gareth was seen on CCTV footage, and it was also the day that they believe he died. According to the coroner, Gareth's body had no injuries on it. There was no sign of a struggle, and his toxicology report showed that he had no drugs or alcohol in his system. The thermostat inside of Gareth's apartment was jacked way up, so it was very hot inside of his apartment, despite the fact it was summer, and it was the height of the summer in August. But regardless, the excessive heat in his apartment sped up the decomposition process and made it impossible to precisely determine a cause of death. Despite a lengthy investigation by police, there was never a conclusive determination as to what exactly happened to Gareth, although there are many theories. Some say the Russian mafia killed him because right before he died, he had been focusing on money laundering in Britain that was tied to the Russian mafia, which would have made him a target. Another theory is MI6 had something to do with Gareth's death, which is why they were not so eager to go looking for him when he didn't come back from his vacation. In fact, one former MI6 agent has come out and said he believes there was a cover-up. He was interviewed by CNN and said that it looked like MI6 had gone into Gareth's apartment ahead of the police and wiped it all down, removing fingerprints and DNA evidence. The last prominent theory is that Gareth did this to himself. It was discovered that he made occasional online visits to bondage sites, and at least one time he'd had to yell out to his landlord to help get him out of his bed because he had tied his wrist to the bed frame and couldn't get himself undone. But when 2 experts who were a part of the investigation attempted to put themselves inside of a similar sized duffel bag and lock it with the padlock on the outside, they couldn't do it despite trying over 400 times. And even if Gareth could have somehow physically got himself inside of this bag and locked it from the outside, how could he have done that without leaving fingerprints all over the bag, all over the lock, the zippers, all over the tub? Because when he was found, he didn't have gloves on. Ultimately, despite the red flags, Gareth's death was determined to be probably an accident and was closed 3 years after his death. On the afternoon of April 10th, 2018, 16-year-old Kyle Plush had just finished classes at Seven Hills High School in Cincinnati, Ohio. He walked out the school's doors and began walking straight across towards the sophomore parking lot where his car, a minivan, was located. Although Kyle had suffered from a spinal cord injury at a young age, he had made a remarkable recovery. He not only walked after his injury, he ran. He went downhill skiing, he biked, he swam, he played soccer. But of all the sports he enjoyed playing, tennis was his favorite. He had joined the high school tennis team and had become one of their best and most popular players. That afternoon, he had a match scheduled, so he needed to get into his minivan and get out his tennis racket and his tennis shoes. And so he made it to the vehicle a little bit after 3 p.m. He slid open the door, he threw his backpack inside, and then he climbed towards the third row back seat of the van where his sneakers were sitting on the bench seat. And so he got to the third row, he turned around and sat down facing the front of the minivan. He took off his school shoes, put on his tennis shoes, and then he got up onto his knees and turned around. So he's facing the back of the van, his knees are on the third row seat, and he began reaching down into the trunk to reach for his bag that contained his tennis racket. And as he was reaching, the third row itself, what he was kneeling on, flipped backwards, dumping him headfirst into the trunk, except all of Kyle's body did not just go tumbling into the trunk space. Instead, his upper half made it about halfway down. He tumbled with the seat, and then he got stuck upside down when the top of that third row seat caught his chest and pressed it up against the back hatch of the van. And so Kyle's upside down, his hands are free in the trunk space, but they're too close to the ground where he can't really press himself out of this position he's in. And this third row seat that's come loose and trapped him like this, it's not locked in position. And so if he goes up at all, the seat goes with him. If he comes down at all, the seat comes with him. And so even trying to push himself back out again, he wouldn't be able to clear the seat because it would just come with him and then come back down again. And so he probably looked for places to pull himself down, hoping that might be a way to clear the obstruction, but there was nothing to grab onto, and his lower half would not have been able to slip through that gap even if the seat was stationary, because no person is supposed to get through that tiny little gap. There was also no inside handle on the back hatch that Kyle could have grabbed and potentially opened the back door. And so he was entirely reliant on somebody showing up and opening the trunk to get him out. But the scariest part of this situation was that loose third row that came forward and trapped Kyle against the back of the van, it weighed nearly 100 pounds and it was driving against his chest. And so he would have had to fight with every breath he took in, pushing up that 100 pounds just to get a marginal breath. But worse than that, if Kyle didn't constantly put air into his chest and keep it full and inflated and strong, that seat would literally crush his chest and kill him. Kyle knew he had to find a way to signal someone that he was in this car. He couldn't reach his phone because it was up in his pants pocket, and that meant getting up around the obstruction, and he couldn't do that. But he had a smartphone and he knew he could use voice-assisted calling. And so at 3:14 p.m., he used his iPhone's voice assistant, Siri, to call 911. As soon as the dispatcher picked up, Kyle was frantic and he was yelling, "Help, help, help, I'm trapped in a minivan in the Seven Hills parking lot. Someone needs to get me out." But the dispatcher couldn't really understand what Kyle was saying because you got to remember, Kyle is yelling from in the trunk space through this collapsed seat up to his phone in his pocket. And the dispatcher was just having a hard time understanding what he was saying. Although if you listen to the audio, it's plainly clear that Kyle is in distress. You can hear that he's yelling and you can hear him banging, which apparently is him banging on the inside of the car. And so they kept asking Kyle, "Where did you say you are? What's going on?" But Kyle, he can't hear his phone. So Kyle just kept frantically repeating his situation, saying his name, where he was located, what was happening to him, in hopes that maybe somebody on the other end of the line would understand what was going on and would come save him. Towards the end of the call, Kyle tells the dispatcher that he thinks he's going to die here. And when the call does cut out, the dispatcher tries calling Kyle back, but it goes to voicemail, and his voicemail only indicated his name was Kyle. It didn't give a last name or anything about him. Not knowing if this was real or a hoax, the dispatcher wrongly labeled this call as unknown trouble when they broadcast it to police. And the dispatcher did not communicate that Kyle was obviously in distress. He was screaming and banging on something throughout the call, and even referenced that he thought he was going to die. Had the dispatcher given Kyle's call a higher priority, fire and rescue would have been alerted, and they could have used their advanced mapping technologies to pinpoint where Kyle's cell phone was, and they could have found him that way. Instead, local police were sent to the Seven Hills High School area to go look around the different parking lots that this caller could have been in. But there was nearly a dozen of these parking lots associated with the high school, making it a huge search area. And again, these police officers were not even aware what they were looking for. They were looking for unknown trouble associated with some caller somewhere around this huge high school. And so the police show up and begin kind of meandering through all these parking lots, staying in their vehicle, just kind of looking around, and they don't see any problems. Although in reality, they were right near Kyle the entire time. At 3:35 p.m., with the police still patrolling the parking lots around the high school, Kyle used Siri to call 911 again, and a different dispatcher dispatcher answered. Now, at this point, it's been 21 minutes since Kyle's first 911 call, and so the weight of that third row is becoming unbearable. His voice is very weak, it's very faint. You can tell he has labored breathing, and every word is punctuated with a long silence as he tries to get out anything he can to try to help himself. And one of the things he says to the dispatcher as soon as they answer is, "If I die, I need you to tell my mother that I love her." And then there's a silence. And Kyle asks them, "Can you hear me?" And there's still a silence. And he says, "This is not a joke. I'm trapped in my gold minivan in the Seven Hills sophomore parking lot. If you don't get here soon, I'm going to die." There's another silence. And then Kyle says, "Hey Siri." And then there's silence. And he says, "Hey Siri" again and again and again. And then it goes silent. The second dispatcher had heard Kyle on this call, but for some reason did not relay to the patrolling officers in the area Kyle's dire situation or his exact position, that he was in this gold Honda Odyssey in the sophomore parking lot. For some reason, that was not communicated to those officers. And so 2 minutes after the second 911 call ended, those two officers left thinking there's nobody here, there's no trouble, and that was it. Kyle was left all alone. 6 hours later, Kyle's father went out looking for him after he didn't come home from his tennis match, and he found his son's minivan parked in the sophomore parking lot at the high school, and when he went up to it, it was too late. His son was still trapped upside down in the back in the trunk, and he had died after the third row had finally crushed his chest, causing him to asphyxiate. Kyle's family is in the middle of a wrongful death lawsuit filed against the city and several employees, and so the legal outcomes of this case are still pending.
If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to come back next week because we put out a brand new mind-boggling medical mystery each week from Ballen Studios and Wondery. This is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballen. A quick reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Matt Almas. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Ryan Patesta. Coordinating producer is Sophia Martins. Our senior producer is Alex Benedin. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Natalie Bettendorf. Fact-checking was done by Sheila Patterson for Ballen Studios. Our producer is Alyssa Tominang. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Executive producers are myself, Mr. Ballen, and Nick Witters. For Wondery. Senior managing producer is Ryan Lohr. Our head of sound is Marcelino Villapando. Our producer is Julie Magruder. Additional support from Natalie Shisha. Senior producers are Laura Donna Palavoda, Dave Schilling and Matt Olmos. Our executive producers are Aaron O'Flaherty and Marshall Lewis. For